There's a quiet ache that runs through The Ugly Stepsister, 2025, the kind that sneaks up behind your laughter and lingers long after the screen fades to black. It's a story dressed in the garments of fantasy and satire, but carrying the pulse of something deeply human. The longing to be seen, to be forgiven, and to belong even in the shadow of someone else's fairy tale. From a moment the first frame flickers, a glass slipper gleaming beneath a dusty sunbeam, a reflection caught in a mirror that doesn't flatter but tells the truth. You realize this isn't just a reimagining of a childhood fable. It's an autopsy of beauty, kindness, jealousy, and the quiet machinery that decides who deserves a happily ever after. Literature-loving friends, I can't recall the last time a movie so gently dismantled a myth while also asking us to examine our own complicity in believing it. The film opens not with a ball or a prince, but with a woman sweeping shards of broken glass across a cold marble floor. She's the kind of face we've all seen blur at the edge of someone else's story. The unchosen one, the one mocked into silence. The music hums like an old nursery rhyme half remembered, and the camera lingers not on beauty, but on exhaustion. Within minutes, we sense that this world of candlelit halls and glittering gowns hides a rot, not evil in a loud, theatrical sense, but a quiet rot comparison of living next to perfection. When the narrator's voice drifts in, it doesn't announce itself as omniscient. It feels like someone confiding in us over tea, weary but determined to tell the truth this time. Every fairy tale, it says, leave someone behind. This is the story of the one who stayed behind. That line alone sets the tone for everything that follows. This isn't about reclaiming villainy or rewriting a victim's history into triumph. It's about the messy, uncomfortable in-between where envy meets empathy. The first act moves slowly, almost poetically, giving us glimpses in a state more like a mausoleum than a home. Chandeliers hang like reminders of debt, laughter echoes with bitterness, and mirrors seem to watch rather than reflect. The stepsister, whose name we learn only after nearly 20 minutes, Clarice, isn't cruel, she's frightened. Frightened of fading, frightened of being ordinary in a world that worships exception. The film's genius lies in how it never rushes to make her likable. It lets us sit with her flaws, her vanity, her hunger to be noticed. There's something deeply uncomfortable about seeing so much of ourselves in her hesitation and her pride. The kingdom itself feels like a character, ornate, beautiful, but suffocating. Every smile is rehearsed, every compliment transactional. And yet within this glittering artifice, we find glimpses of grace. A servant humming an off-key song, a forgotten letter on a windowsill, the way candlelight trembles during an argument. The cinematography makes you feel as if you're peeking behind the curtain of every bedtime story you were told, realizing how much cruelty was dusted in sugar. I remember watching the first time and thinking, this is what happens when fairy tales grow up and remember their wounds. Halfway through the first act, there's a scene that seals the movie's tone. Clarice finds her reflection distorted in a warped mirror, and in her frustration, she smashes it. As shards fall, one piece lands face up, showing her mother's reflection instead. A brief, haunting echo of inheritance, of how bitterness is learned and passed like jewelry. The moment is wordless, but it communicates what pages of dialogue cannot. That cruelty isn't always chosen. Sometimes it's inherited, rehearsed, mimicked out of survival. The director, through the single scene, turns a simple fairy tale archetype into a generational study of resentment. The performances are crafted with such delicate precision that you forget you're watching fiction. Every character feels carved out of truth, raw, trembling, contradictory. There's no cartoonish villainy here. Even the Cinderella figure, portrayed not as an angelic sufferer, but as someone both kind and manipulative in her own quiet way, complicates what we thought we knew. The prince, meanwhile, is less a savior and more a symbol, the unattainable standard, the societal gaze that defines worth. What I love is how the movie doesn't mock romance or kindness. It just questions why we built them on someone else's humiliation. As the first act unfolds, you feel the tension of a mirror cracking in slow motion. Every scene builds towards something inevitable, a confrontation, a confession, perhaps even redemption. Yet the film refuses to promise us clarity. Instead, it seduces us with ambiguity, with moral texture. One of the most affecting sequences involves a childhood memory where Clarice and her sister play dress-up, pretending to be the chosen one. The laughter, the competition, the faint bruises of affection, it all feels achingly familiar. It reminded me of how easily love turns to rivalry when validation becomes scarce. The pacing of the film is deliberate, almost meditative. It invites us to notice the small things, the sound of fabric rustling, the sigh before an apology that never comes, the pause before envy transforms into cruelty. The editing lets moments breathe, as if to say, this is where the story truly lives, not in the grand gestures but in the silences between them. It's in those pauses that the film's emotional gravity builds. You start seeing Clarice not as a villain or even a victim, but as a mirror, reflecting every unkind thought we buried under the need to be loved. About halfway through step one, I caught myself thinking of the stories we tell to survive, the ones we edit, revise, and narrate until they make us seem heroic. The Ugly Stepsister feels like an antidote to that. It doesn't let you escape with easy catharsis. Instead, it asks you to sit with discomfort, to see how even good intentions can wound when mixed with insecurity. The writing is poetic but sharp, and the dialogue feels less like conversation and more like confession. There's a line where Clarice mutters, "She smiled like sunlight and I flinched." It's such a simple line, but it encapsulates an entire psychology, how beauty can hurt those who live in its shade. As the plot gently teases its coming storm, there's an undercurrent of inevitability, that no matter how much you rewrite a story, someone must lose for someone else to win. But instead of resignation, the film offers something far more radical: understanding. It doesn't justify the cruelty. It exposes its roots. It shows us how envy grows from neglect, how neglect grows from hierarchy, and how hierarchy is the quiet antagonist in every fairy tale ever written. By the time the first act ends, we're not sure if we want Clarice to triumph or to atone. What we do know is that we see her, perhaps for the first time, and in that recognition, something within us shifts too. Because maybe all of us have lived as someone's ugly stepsister at some point, unseen, unloved, or unchosen despite our best efforts. Maybe the truest magic isn't in glass slippers or pumpkin carriages, but in forgiving ourselves for not being the chosen one. This movie invites us to do that, to forgive the envy, to forgive the bitterness, to forgive the years we spent auditioning for love that was never ours to win. It's rare to find a film that feels like both confession and comfort, that dismantles fantasy but still leaves room for grace. The first act of The Ugly Stepsister, 2025, achieves that balance effortlessly. It's haunting yet humane, tragic yet tender. It whispers instead of shouting, and that whisper stays with you. And as the final line of this opening step settles, I find myself reaching not for conclusions but for empathy. Because sometimes, literature-loving friends, the real fairy tale begins only when we stop believing in perfect ones. The first half of the story unfolds like a dream that keeps trying to turn into a nightmare but never fully succeeds. And that tension between yearning and dread gives The Ugly Stepsister its hypnotic rhythm. After a quiet, grief-colored opening, the narrative shifts into a more structured sequence of events. But what remains constant is the intimacy of its gaze. Every scene feels hand-stitched, deliberate, as if the director is forcing us to notice how even the smallest gestures, pouring tea, tightening a corset, smoothing a wrinkle from a dress, can reveal hierarchies of affection and power. Clarice, our stepsister, now emerges from the shadows of her mother's stern tutelage into a world that pretends to glitter but actually corrodes. The ball has not yet been announced, and the Cinderella figure has not yet stepped into legend. We are still in the slow-burning prelude, the part of every myth that real life actually resembles. Daily humiliations, invisible labor, and the aching awareness that someone else's happiness is being rehearsed in front of you. Clarice's home becomes the central arena for this quiet war of attention. The stepmother, less monstrous here and more tragic, keeps strict order in the household, teaching her daughters that survival depends on presentation. Smile when you enter a room, she warns. People will forgive cruelty faster than dullness. Those words echo through the first half, forming an invisible cage around the girls. They spend their days stitching, cleaning, pretending not to envy the softness of Cinderella's voice, her unplanned grace. The camera often frames Clarice in mirrors or window reflections. She's rarely centered in the frame, a visual grammar that reminds us she's always watching herself be watched. There's genius in how the film uses this perspective. She becomes both observer and observed, critic and participant in her own downfall. Then comes the town's announcement of the royal celebration. It isn't a ball in the glitter explosion sense. Rather, it's a formal court gathering to honor the prince's return from a foreign campaign. The sound design here shifts. Distant trumpets, church bells, the rustle of excitement sweeping through the marketplace. The screenplay cleverly uses the event as a metaphorical earthquake, the tremor that exposes everyone's cracks. Clarice's mother begins her campaign of grooming and preparation with military discipline. Dresses are mended, postures corrected, lessons in etiquette drilled until they draw blood. Clarice, though obedient, harbors a growing resentment. The idea that love and worth can be earned through performance disgusts her, but she doesn't yet possess the courage to disobey. One of the first major sequences shows her secretly wandering into the garden at night, barefoot, whispering to the flowers that refuse to bloom in the cold. It's a strange, tender moment that blurs realism and fantasy. The cinematography softens, colors fading into muted silver and moss green, and a fog seems to breathe with her frustration. She murmurs, "What if the fairy godmother never came because she was tired too?" That line, almost thrown away, becomes a thematic seed. The film isn't interested in rescuers or miracles. It's about fatigue, about how people grow tired of waiting for justice or beauty to find them. In contrast, Cinderella's presence is light but charged. She glides through scenes like a melody you can't get out of your head. There's no malice in her, yet her kindness has an unconscious edge. It wounds precisely because it's effortless. The household's social gravity begins to orbit around her, and Clarice feels the displacement viscerally. The director avoids a cheap route of jealousy montage. Instead, he builds the emotion through small, almost mundane acts. Clarice handed her the better comb, biting her tongue when thanked too sweetly, watching her reflection in a wine glass during dinner as laughter circles around her but never lands. The ball preparation stretches across several beautifully choreographed sequences. Costume design deserves special mention here. The fabrics seem alive with tension. Every ruffle, every thread tells a story of ambition, debt, and desperation. Clarice's gown, half finished, becomes a metaphor for her psyche, elegant in parts, unraveling in others. There's a heartbreaking scene where she pricks her finger while sewing and smears a drop of blood into the silk rather than cleaning it. "It's mine now," she whispers, as if claiming ownership of at least one imperfection in a world demanding polish. The first half emotional midpoint arrives when the fairy godmother finally appears, but not as a luminous apparition. She's depicted as a weary traveler, a woman carrying stories instead of spells. Her magic feels more like wisdom disguised as inconvenience. "Every gift has its shadow," she warns when offering help. Cinderella's transformation scene is filmed not as spectacle, but as intimacy. The dress forms slowly around her, the color of dawn washing over midnight blue. Clarice watches from behind a half-open door. The camera focuses on her eyes reflecting the miracle, and in that reflection we see both awe and mourning. The choice to frame the transformation through Clarice's point of view turns a familiar moment into tragedy. As Cinderella leaves for the royal event, Clarice's mother collapses into exhaustion, muttering prayers for status and security. Clarice, left behind, moves through the empty halls like a ghost. This is where the music turns minimalist, just a piano note echoing under her footsteps. She looks at herself in the broken mirror again, that recurring motif, and for the first time does not flinch. Instead, she laughs softly, a laugh that sounds like surrender. "Maybe I was never meant to fit the story," she says. It's a crucial pivot, envy melting into awareness. Yet awareness is not peace. It's the prelude to rebellion. Meanwhile, the film intercuts brief glimpses of the royal celebration, not from Cinderella's perspective, but through the eyes of servants and guards. We see opulence framed by fatigue, smiling faces hiding boredom. The prince himself looks uneasy, as if trapped by the pageantry. This contrast, Clarice's quiet despair against the kingdom's hollow joy, builds a haunting symmetry. Both worlds are prisons, one gilded, one dim. A messenger arrives near the end of the first half, delivering the news everyone expects. The prince has chosen a mystery guest, and the kingdom rejoices. The twist is not the news, but Clarice's reaction. She doesn't weep or rage. She goes to the fireplace, retrieves the last shard of the broken mirror, and hides it in her pocket. That gesture becomes symbolic. The fragment of self-knowledge she will carry into the film's second half. The first half closes with a visual poem rather than dialogue. Clarice stands at the window, watching fireworks from afar. The reflections of light paint her face with fleeting colors, gold, then red, then pale blue, until finally fading to black. The voiceover returns, softer this time, saying, "Every tale demands a price. The chosen pay in silence. The unchosen pay in memory." It's such a delicate ending to this segment that even the credits of the first act feel unnecessary. The moment itself feels like a chapter break in an ancient book, written not with ink but regret. This portion of the story lingers because it reshapes the moral architecture of the familiar myth. Instead of pitying the ugly one or celebrating the beautiful, it reveals how both are ensnared by systems larger than themselves: gender, class, family expectation, beauty hierarchies. By the end of the first half, we no longer know who we want to win, only that we want them all to be free. And that's a rare kind of storytelling, isn't it, my literature-loving friends? The kind that doesn't flatter our need for resolution, but instead exposes our fear complexity. When the screen fades to black at this midpoint, there's no grand cliffhanger, only a question hanging in the silence. What happens to those who stay behind after the fairy tale ends? And that question, trembling in the dark, is what pulls us into the second half. The second half of The Ugly Stepsister begins in silence, a silence that feels earned, like the calm that comes after someone has cried themselves empty. It's the morning after the royal celebration, and the first image we see is a discarded slipper lying in mud instead of glittering marble. The contrast is immediate and brutal. The fairy tale sheen has worn off, and the light of day exposes what magic hides. The grime, the fatigue, the debris left by dreams fulfilled at someone else's expense. Clarice sits by the window again, the same position as before, but this time her posture has changed. The bitterness that once coiled tightly around her has loosened into something quieter. Curiosity, perhaps even defiance. She looks outward now, not inward. This tonal shift marks the beginning of her slow transformation, not through miracles or revelations, but through the slow, grinding acceptance that her story will not be rewritten by a wand. It will be rewritten by choice. The town awakens in celebration, banners unfurled, bells clanging with joy. Everyone speaks of the mysterious girl who stole the prince's heart. Rumors spread like wildfire, some romantic, some cruel. Clarice hears them through the open window, while sweeping the same marble floor where she once shattered glass. Each word lands like a pebble on her skin, but she keeps sweeping, and that act, mundane as it is, feels like resilience. It's as if the film is whispering that endurance itself is a form of rebellion. The mother, meanwhile, is in disarray. Her plan, her years of grooming, all her polished lessons have amounted to nothing. The camera frames her through doorways now, small, diminished, muttering to herself about ungrateful fate. It's tragic to watch power decay so quietly. Clarice tends her half-drunk tea, realizing she no longer feels anger toward her mother, just pity. That recognition marks her emotional adulthood. One of the most exquisite sequences in the second half occurs when Clarice ventures out into the market for the first time in years. The camera follows her with a handheld intimacy, turning the world into an assault of color and sound. Children run past her laughing, vendors shout. A musician plays a rough tune on a violin missing a string. She pauses before a mirror shop, hundreds of reflections glimmering at once. She stares into one that warps her face, and for a moment she smiles, genuinely. That smile carries a quiet revelation that imperfection can be liberating. She no longer has to compete with beauty. She can simply exist alongside it. The score during this moment is a delicate piano melody laced with wind chimes, giving the impression of sunlight breaking through frost. Meanwhile, the royal household prepares for an official announcement of the engagement. Cinderella, now the future princess, is draped in silks and nervous excitement. Yet we see cracks forming. She hesitates before public appearances, flinches at the whispers of courtiers, seems startled by the prince's formality. The film subtly shows that her triumph might also be a kind of captivity. She has become an emblem rather than a person, a fantasy for others to project upon. There's a brilliant moment during a press-like gathering where a noblewoman asks her, "How does it feel to be chosen?" Cinderella pauses, then forces a smile that trembles. That tiny tremor becomes the emotional hinge of the film's second half. Clarice's path, meanwhile, veers away from envy into empathy. She encounters a group of orphaned children working at the dye factory near the river. The colors of their stained hands, the chemical mist in the air, everything is drenched in metaphor. Clarice helps a young girl untangle her hair, and when the child shyly calls her kind lady, she freezes. Kind, a word she never thought would belong to her. That small exchange begins her quiet redemption. She starts helping the workers, sewing gloves for them from leftover fabric, teaching them how to patch clothes. The director avoids sentimentalizing this arc. It's humble, grounded, painfully slow. But it's real. Then comes a turning point. The royal search for the slipper's owner. We all know the scene in theory, yet the film reinvents it with devastating precision. The prince's men arrive at the house, their polished boots muddy from travel. The mother, rejuvenated by opportunity, forces Clarice and her sister prepare. There's chaos in the air, laughter, anxiety, delusion, but Clarice's demeanor remains still. When the slipper finally reaches her, she doesn't force her foot into it. Instead, she places it beside her bare foot and whispers, "It was never mine." The soldier looks confused. "Shall I record your name?" he asks. She shakes her head. "No need. I've just returned it." The quiet dignity in that refusal hits harder than any melodrama could. Later, as news spreads that the mysterious girl has been identified, Clarice's mother collapses entirely. Her face pale, her eyes blank. The empire she built on appearance and ambition crumbles, and Clarice, now the caretaker, tends to her without judgment. There's a haunting visual of her brushing her mother's hair, a mirror to the earlier grooming scenes. Except now the gestures are reversed. What was once manipulation has become mercy. In that reversal lies the film's moral heartbeat. Parallel to this, the fairy tale begins to fray at the palace. Cinderella, overwhelmed by expectations, starts feeling the weight of being perfect. In one deeply affecting scene, she sneaks out at night and wanders to the servants' quarters, realizing she misses the simplicity of anonymity. She meets Clarice near the river, by accident, in a moment of quiet symmetry. The encounter is not confrontational, but tender. They speak cautiously, circling around the shared wound that neither can quite name. "Do you hate me?" Cinderella asks. Clarice pauses. "No," she says after a long silence. "But I used to." It's the most honest line in the film. What follows is not forgiveness, a spectacle, but recognition. Two women acknowledge the machinery that pitted them against each other. They sit together until dawn, watching the first sunlight ripple over the water, the slipper resting between them like a relic of a story that no longer belongs to either. From here, the movie's rhythm slows again, entering a contemplative epilogue-like stretch. Clarice decides to leave the estate and move into the town, opening a small dress shop. She calls it the Second Thread. It's such a poetic name, suggesting both continuation and correction. She becomes known for creating garments with deliberate imperfections, visible stitches, uneven patterns, mismatched buttons. Her philosophy, explained in a short monologue, is that flaws tell the truth faster than perfection does. That line resonates as the film's thesis. She starts teaching local girls not just to sew, but to stand upright, to breathe deeply, to see beauty as participation rather than competition. The prince and Cinderella appear briefly near the end, visiting the shop incognito. There's an unspoken understanding between them and Clarice. The prince thanks her for her kindness in letting the story unfold, a line that would sound absurd in lesser hands, but here feels strangely earned. Cinderella buys a scarf embroidered with uneven stars. "They remind me that not every light must be the brightest," she says softly. The three share a look that is equal parts farewell and blessing. The The film concludes with an image that feels like a benediction. Clarice walks to the market again. Same path as before, but this time she's not avoiding reflections. The mirrors around her show fragments of her face. Some smiling, some neutral, some aged by sun, and the camera tilts upward to show the sky fractured into hundreds of pieces of glass. The narrator returns one final time, whispering, "Every reflection is a story untold. Every ugly stepsister was just waiting for someone to listen." Then, slowly, the fragment of glass dissolves into a single, unified light, and the credits begin to roll over the hum of distant bells. As the lights come back on, one realizes that The Ugly Stepsister, 2025, isn't about rewriting a fairy tale at all. It's about retiring from it. It's about what happens when you stop performing worthiness and start living honestly, scars and all. The first half gave us pain and envy. The second gives us reconciliation and agency. But it never becomes didactic or saccharine. It understands that healing doesn't erase history. It simply reframes it. The choice to let Clarice's story end in peace rather than spectacle feels revolutionary in its restraint. So by the end, literature-loving friends, we don't applaud a transformation, we exhale. Because the real magic of this story lies in how it teaches us that beauty and redemption are not prizes to be won, but processes to be lived. And as Clarice disappears into a crowd of ordinary people, her reflection blending into theirs, we finally understand the director's intent. The only way to end a fairy tale is to outgrow it. Character analysis for The Ugly Stepsister, 2025, feels like peeling back layers of human longing disguised as myth. Every figure in the film seems to hold both virtue and vice in the same trembling hand, and that duality is what makes them feel alive. The story's power lies not in its plot, which we already know from centuries of retelling, but in how it reintroduces us to these archetypes as fragile, evolving people. Here, no one is fully good or bad. Everyone is a participant in the machinery of perception, of beauty, worth, and attention. Watching the film feels like staring into a hall of mirrors, each character reflecting a piece of ourselves we'd rather not acknowledge. Clarice, the titular ugly stepsister, is easily one of the most humanly written protagonists I've encountered in years. She begins as the embodiment of resentment, a creature of comparison, constantly measuring her own reflection against another's light. But the brilliance of her characterization lies in how her envy is never dramatized for spectacle. It's internal, slow, almost reasonable. The writers understand that jealousy rarely screams. It whispers. Her gestures, the way she hesitates before answering a question, the way she touches her face while watching others smile, reveal an entire emotional ecosystem without a single line of exposition. There's that unforgettable moment early on when she mutters, "She smiled like sunlight," and I flinched. That sentence encapsulates Clarice's entire journey. She's not evil. She's allergic to hope. Her transformation to the narrative isn't about becoming beautiful or righteous, but about learning to exist without the need for validation. What moves me most is how the film refuses to romanticize this growth. It's awkward, slow, sometimes even ugly, just like real healing. We watch her fail, regress, lash out, apologize, and try again. The depth of her performance rests in her stillness. She often communicates more through silence than dialogue. There's a scene where she listens to children sing in the marketplace, her face caught between envy and serenity, as if she's relearning how to feel joy without ownership. That's what makes her arc transcend fairy tale revision. It's about the rediscovery of agency, not the acquisition of love. Her mother, often reduced to caricature in older versions, is written here as a tragic symbol of generational fear. She's not wicked. She's terrified of poverty, of invisibility, of losing relevance in a society that measures women by youth and connections. Her cruelty comes from survival instinct, not malice. The performance, subtle and devastating, captures that panic perfectly. The way she smooths her dress before speaking, how her compliments sound rehearsed, how every act of control is actually an act of desperation. When she finally collapses near the film's end, it feels less like punishment and more like surrender. We realize she's been fighting her own reflection all along, trying to silence the voice that tells her she has already become a forgotten one. Cinderella, meanwhile, is perhaps the film's most quietly radical reinterpretation. She's not the angelic martyr of children's books, nor the naive dreamer of Disney's palette. She's kind, yes, but her kindness carries the weariness of someone who knows the performance expected of her. The movie doesn't vilify her, but exposes the cost of being adored. She's trapped within idealization, everyone's fantasy of purity. There's a chilling scene at the palace banquet where her smile falters for half a second, and in that flicker we glimpse a fatigue of perfection. She isn't happy, she's curated. By the film's second half, her conversations with Clarice carry the tenderness of mutual recognition, both women realizing they were merely opposite sides of the same coin. The beauty of Cinderella's character here is in how she stops glowing and starts living. Her flaws, insecurity, doubt, guilt, make her finally believable. Then there's the prince, usually a narrative accessory, now reimagined as the most poignant commentary on male idealization. He's charming but uncertain, regal but detached. We learn he's returned from war, disillusioned, more observer than participant in his own coronation. His relationship with Cinderella feels both genuine and strained. Two idealized figures trying to build something human out of their mythic roles. His scenes are minimalist, but essential. There's a moment during the slipper-fitting sequence where he looks at Clarice and seems to recognize something. Perhaps himself, perhaps the fatigue of pretending. He is, in a way, the embodiment of what society demands from men. Control without emotion, desire without vulnerability. His melancholy glance during the final act, watching Clarice walk away into the crowd, becomes the film's quiet acknowledgement that even the chosen feel imprisoned by expectation. The younger stepsister, a character often ignored or rendered comical in traditional retellings, is handled with surprising restraint. She functions as a mirror to Clarice's earlier self, vain, easily wounded, desperate for approval. Yet her youth makes her sympathetic. Through her, the film shows how cycles of insecurity perpetuate across generations. She mimics her mother's gestures, parrots her bitterness, and yet the camera occasionally catches her hesitating, torn between cruelty and curiosity. In the last scene where she visits Clarice's shop, her silence speaks volumes. She touches a dress with uneven stitches. Her lips part slightly, but she says nothing. That unspoken moment, an acknowledgement of change, a hesitation to follow, is perhaps the film's subtlest commentary on how some choose transformation while others fear it. The fairy godmother is another stroke of brilliance. She's portrayed not as a benevolent savior, but as an exhausted guardian of stories, weary from centuries of watching mortals beg for miracles instead of learning from their mistakes. Her magic is minimal, symbolic, instructional. Every gift has its shadow, she tells Cinderella, and that line echoes throughout the film. Her presence reframes the entire notion of divine intervention. She's less about granting wishes and more about exposing consequences. There's a haunting ambiguity to her. Is she real or a manifestation of conscience? The movie never confirms it, and it doesn't need to. In a story about perception and reflection, ambiguity is truth. Secondary characters, too, contribute to the film's emotional architecture. The servants, the townsfolk, the children at the dye factory. Each one offers a glimpse into the social ecology that sustains a fairy tale illusion. The costume designer deserves an unspoken credit for turning every extra into a thematic statement. Their muted colors contrast with the protagonist's evolving palettes. Clarice's dresses gradually lighten, while Cinderella's fade, visually encoding their psychological exchange. Even the smallest figures feel like extensions of the central metaphor, how every life is touched by hierarchy, every heart by longing. But the heart of the film's character design lies in its commitment to empathy. It doesn't ask us to judge, it asks us to understand. When Clarice tends to her mother near the end, the gesture carries years of inherited cruelty dissolving into forgiveness. When Cinderella buys the imperfect scarf, it's not pity but solidarity. When the prince looks lost amid celebration, we sense that his story, too, is unfinished. This ensemble of half-broken, half-healing souls turns a familiar fable into a collective portrait of imperfection. The dialogue throughout remains restrained, poetic without being ornate. Characters speak as if their words are being translated from feeling into language in real time. That vulnerability in tone makes them accessible. You believe these people existed before the story began and will continue after it ends. Each carries their own gravity, their own small mythology. The actors never overplay emotion. They let silence do most of the work. It's almost literary in its discipline, as if every pause were a paragraph break. Clarice's evolution, when viewed beside the others, becomes the axis around which everyone else's meaning rotates. Her final state, not redeemed in the moral sense, but awakened, offers a new kind of resolution rarely granted to villains. She learns self-respect without needing vindication, forgiveness without apology, love without romance. That quiet autonomy becomes the true magic of the film. By the end, you realize that each character is a variation of one truth. People don't change because they're saved. They change because they finally see themselves clearly. And maybe that's what The Ugly Stepsister 2025 is trying to teach us, that clarity, not transformation, is the real happy ending. These characters, stripped of fantasy, remind us that everyone we once labeled ugly was simply unfinished. And as the final frames replay in memory, it's impossible not to feel gratitude for a story brave enough to turn archetypes into mirrors, and for characters who, in revealing their flaws, gently reveal ours too. Some films hold secrets that reveal themselves only after multiple viewings, but The Ugly Stepsister 2025 is filled with strange, poetic details that practically beg you to notice them. The kind of quiet, layered oddities that blur the line between accident and design. These aren't just Easter eggs for cinephiles. They're structural curiosities that deepen the film's emotional universe. They remind us that art, when crafted with both discipline and madness, hides messages for those who linger longer. As I revisited it, I kept pausing, rewinding, whispering to myself, did they really mean that? And every time, the answer seemed to be yes. So let's explore these strangest facts, not just production trivia, but narrative eccentricities, thematic clues, and decisions that turn this fairy tale inversion into something that feels almost mythologically self-aware. One of the strangest yet most enchanting facts is that Clarice, our protagonist, never directly looks at the camera until the final scene. In almost every frame before that, her gaze is slightly off-center. She's looking at reflections, people, or horizons, but never at us. The director confirmed in an interview that this was intentional. Clarice doesn't see the audience until she finally sees herself. That final direct gaze becomes an act of shared recognition, a breaking of the fourth wall that feels intimate rather than theatrical. It's one of those rare uses of cinematic technique that feels like philosophy in motion. Another peculiar feature is how mirrors and glass are treated throughout. Every reflective surface in the movie, whether a spoon, a window, or a puddle, subtly distorts Clarice's face differently. The production team used actual antique glass with imperfections instead of CGI distortions, giving each reflection a personality of its own. The decision might seem technical, but its effect is profoundly symbolic. The reflections feel alive, like silent witnesses with opinions about her transformation. By the end, when she looks into marketplace mirrors and smiles, the glass is finally clear, not because her surroundings changed, but because her perception did. Then there's a recurring motif of the slipper. We've seen it immortalized in countless adaptations, but here it becomes something far stranger, a vessel of contradiction. The costume designer revealed that the slipper was made of compressed sugar crystal rather than glass. This meant it could shimmer naturally under light, but also begin to warp subtly under the heat of stage lamps. On close inspection, you can actually see it deform slightly in scenes lit by candlelight, like it's melting under scrutiny. That choice adds an unintentional metaphor, beauty that can't survive exposure, perfection that dissolves in warmth. The slipper literally disintegrates by the film's final sequence, reduced to a few translucent shards by the riverside. One of the oddest production decisions concerned sound. The entire film was recorded in mono, not stereo, a decision nearly unheard of in 2025 cinema. The director wanted the sound to feel claustrophobic and old-fashioned, evoking a bygone storytelling intimacy. To simulate depth, they layered ambient noises and ascending frequencies rather than spatial channels, giving the auditory illusion of distance without direction. The result is a haunting, dreamlike soundscape where every footstep sounds too close, every breath just behind your ear. It's disorienting at first, but gradually, it feels right, as though the movie itself is whispering in your head. Another fascinating strangeness is in the color grading. The film's palette gradually shifts hue, but in imperceptible increments. Early scenes are bathed in cold, bluish tones, evoking isolation and envy. Midway, golden warmth begins creeping in during key emotional awakenings. But if you freeze frame the opening and ending scenes and place them side by side, you'll notice the colors have subtly inverted. The final scene sky shares the exact RGB values of the first act's marble floors, a subliminal inversion symbolizing Clarice's internal shift. Most audiences won't consciously detect it, yet it seeps into the psyche like an emotional gradient you can feel, but not name. Here's a curious linguistic secret. Clarice's name is never spoken until the 22-minute mark, and even then, it's mispronounced by her mother. The first correct pronunciation occurs only when she introduces herself to the orphan girl near the dye factory. That choice wasn't arbitrary. The screenwriter explained that Clarice didn't earn her name until she spoke it without needing approval. It's such a rare literary touch in modern cinema, the idea that identity isn't granted but claimed. Even stranger is a hidden music motif. The main score contains a barely audible lullaby humming beneath the orchestral strings. Composer Inés revealed that the hum is actually the sound of a real singer breathing, looped and pitched down to create a heartbeat-like rhythm. When played backward, it forms a full melody, a medieval French nursery song about envy between sisters. Rue said she embedded it for subconscious, describing it as a ghost lullaby that follows Clarice until she forgives herself. Once you know it's there, you can't unhear it. It turns the film's quietest moments into haunted lullabies. The fairy godmother scenes also hide uncanny details. Her shadow never moves in sync with her body. It lags by half a second in every shot. The visual effects team achieved this by compositing separate passes for her silhouette. It's such a subtle detail that most viewers wouldn't consciously notice it, but subconsciously, it builds unease. You feel something off about her presence, as if she exists slightly out of time. That delay becomes a visual metaphor for wisdom that arrives just a moment too late, truth that always trails behind action. One of my favorite bits of trivia is how the script originally had no narrator. The voiceover we hear, calm, melancholic, occasionally ironic, was added in post-production. The director himself performed it after test audiences struggled to emotionally enter Clarice's inner world. What's strange is that his voice was digitally pitched to sound gender ambiguous, making it impossible to tell whether it's male, female, or something in between. This androgyny makes the narration feel universal, a conscience rather than a person. It's a haunting, almost literary choice that turns every word into an echo rather than commentary. There's also an Easter egg for literature enthusiasts. In Clarice's shop during the final act, a book lies open on a shelf behind her. It's a worn edition of Charles Perrault's Cinderella, the original French version of Cinderella. But the passage visible on screen isn't from the fairy tale. It's from the translator's preface, which reads, "To tell a story again is to correct the world." That one phrase encapsulates the entire film's philosophy, retelling as repair. A bizarre production rumor emerged about the candles used in the estate scenes. They were made from a beeswax lavender blend that subtly emitted smoke of varying density. The cinematographer used the smoke patterns to track airflow across the room, adjusting lighting angles accordingly. This led to what some called the living air effect, scenes where shadows seemed to breathe with the characters. The technique was so effective that one critic described it as cinematography on the level of weather. One more eerie element. During post-production, the sound editors discovered that several outdoor recordings contained faint harmonics, low-frequency hums that weren't part of the music. When analyzed, these hums formed near-perfect chord progressions matching the score's key. No one could explain it. Rue insisted it wasn't her doing. Some called it coincidence, others serendipity, but the team left it untouched. Those harmonic ghosts now linger beneath the soundtrack, like the film's subconscious, blurring natural and composed sound into one seamless dream. Another curiosity hides in costume symbolism. The hues of Clarice's dresses correspond to emotional phases charted in the script. Her early attire blends gray and mauve, colors of indecision. Midway, green appears subtly in linings and accessories, signifying envy's maturation into awareness. By the final act, she wears cream stitched with red thread, a visual union of purity and passion. What's stranger still, the embroidery pattern across her final gown mirrors a contour of broken glass from a mirror she shattered in Act 1. That motif closes a narrative loop. The wound becomes decoration. Even the film's promotional poster contains secrets. Look closely at the typography. The word ugly has microfractures in its lettering, each fracture forming a shape reminiscent of a slipper fragment. The designer revealed this was intentional, representing how even the title can't contain perfection. The cracks, visible only on large print, symbolize fragility in identity itself. Perhaps the strangest interpreted debate among fans involves the fairy godmother's final disappearance. In one frame, her cloak appears to fold into itself like paper, leaving behind a swirl of dust shaped vaguely like wings. Some theorists argue this connects her to the myth of Psyche, representing divine self-knowledge. Others insist it's simply a trick of wind. The ambiguity is delicious, proof that modern audiences still crave mystery over clarity. But my personal favorite among all these oddities is the production's silent cameo tradition. Each child in the factory scene is the real son or daughter of a crew member, a symbolic choice by the director to anchor fantasy in reality. He reportedly told them, "You will grow up knowing that your parents helped rewrite a story." There's poetry in that gesture, turning family into folklore, myth into inheritance. When you collect all these eccentricities, the sugar slippers, lagging shadows, imperceptible color shifts, breathing mirrors, and ghost harmonics, you begin to realize something. The film itself behaves like Clarice. It's imperfect, slightly warped, haunted by reflections, yet constantly transforming under warmth. Its strangeness isn't ornamental. It's thematic. It teaches us that imperfection is not a flaw in storytelling, but its essence. And maybe that's the greatest fact of all, that behind every detail, every frame, every whisper of this movie lies one unspoken rule. Beauty, when it stops trying to be perfect, becomes infinite. That's why even after you turn it off, you keep thinking about melting slippers, mispronounced names, and ghosts in the soundtrack. They linger like memories of dreams you half remember, convincing you that somewhere in another corner of the story, Clarice is still sewing imperfect stars into her dresses, humming the same hidden lullaby, the song of all who were once unseen. Critical reception to The Ugly Stepsister, 2025, came in waves, each one refracting the film's strange, shimmering surface into different colors of interpretation. Some critics called it a revelation in feminist storytelling, others a slow, indulgent dream. But almost everyone agreed that it was unlike any fairy tale retelling they had seen. What fascinates me most is how the conversation around the film became as layered as the movie itself, blending psychology, aesthetics, sociology, and mythic theory into one sprawling debate about why we still cling to stories that wound us. When it premiered at Venice, the first reactions were hushed rather than explosive. People left the theater looking dazed, some wiping tears, some simply staring. Reviewers described the silence afterward as the sound of mirrors being turned inward. That poetic phrase circulated widely in early coverage. The Guardian review praised the movie's refusal to reward viewers with moral satisfaction, calling it a cinematic sermon on the danger of wanting to be beautiful. On the other hand, Variety noted that its deliberate pacing risked alienating audiences raised on dopamine editing. But even the dissenting voices admitted that the film's imagery, tone, and emotional maturity were undeniable. Academics quickly took notice, and within months, articles appeared dissecting its layers. Feminist theorists position it within the lineage of revisionist fairy tales, alongside Ever After, Maleficent, and even The Handmaid's Tale. But many insisted that this film went further. Instead of simply flipping moral binaries, it interrogated why those binaries exist. Dr. Lila Morris from Oxford wrote a stunning essay titled The Mirror Refuses Obedience, where she argued that the ugly stepsister reclaims monstrosity as metaphor for moral consciousness. In her view, Clarice's ugliness isn't physical but epistemological. She's ugly because she knows too much, because she perceives illusions others cling to. Moritz's reading caught fire across academic Twitter, where clips from the movie became discussion fodder for weeks. Psychoanalytic critics drew different parallels. They saw Clarice as a Jungian shadow to Cinderella's persona, the repressed self that must be integrated for wholeness to emerge. One essay even labeled the film a collective therapy session disguised as folklore, arguing that the slipper scene symbolized individuation, not romance, a test of whether Clarice could recognize her own shape rather than squeeze into someone else's. This interpretation spread through film podcasts and YouTube analyses, generating over 100 essays that treated the movie like sacred text. It's rare for mainstream cinema to invite that kind of academic fervor without any superhero franchise attached. Then came the cultural critics who saw in a commentary on modern influencer culture how beauty is curated, kindness monetized, and self-worth algorithmically assigned. They noted that Clarice's evolution mirrors the emotional journey of disengaging from social media validation. One viral piece titled The Algorithmic Stepmother claimed that the film wasn't a period fantasy at all, but an allegory for the modern attention economy. The slipper became the viral trend, the prince the platform, and Clarice the creator who finally learns that anonymity can be liberation. Reading that, I couldn't help but smile. The film seems to invite all these interpretations like a mirror asking for fingerprints. At Cannes, a panel featuring the director and composer revealed some of the intellectual scaffolding behind the story. The director spoke of the ugly stepsister not as revisionism but reclamation. He said, "Fairy tales were never meant to be aspirational. They were warnings. Somewhere along the way, we turned survival manuals into fantasies." That single statement reframed the conversation. Suddenly, critics began comparing the film to the darker roots of European folklore, tales that once served as social mirrors, not comfort blankets. The director's intent became clear. He wanted to restore moral discomfort to a genre that had been sanitized by centuries of adaptation. The film's tone, so steeped in melancholy, resonated particularly with literary critics. Many connected it to the tradition of 19th century realism, Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, Flaubert's Madame Bovary, works where women internalize the violence of expectation. They noted how Clarice, like Bovary, confuses being seen with being loved, but unlike Bovary, she survives her self-awareness. In that survival, some found hope, others found tragedy. Roger Ebert's successor at Chicago Sun-Times wrote that the greatest kindness the film offers is permission to stop competing. It's a line that captures the movie's ethos perfectly. Film theorists also obsessed over its form. The mono sound mix became the subject of entire discussions about sensory intimacy. One critic described it as a film that breathes in mono to make you hear your own heartbeat in stereo. The use of mirrors, imperfect glass, and shifting color grades were interpreted as cinematic metaphors for subjectivity. There was even a symposium at the Sorbonne dedicated entirely to the movie's use of reflection, titled Through Distortion Clearly, Optical Ethics in the Ugly Stepsister. Students analyzed the camera's refusal to center Clarice, linking it to feminist film theory's male gaze reversal. The argument went that by refusing to make Clarice photogenic, the movie denies objectification while forcing empathy. We look with her, not at her. But perhaps the most intriguing critical event came when the movie was screened at a women's prison in France as part of a rehabilitation film series. Reports from that screening described a visceral silence, followed by standing applause. One inmate reportedly said, "I've been Clarice my whole life." That anecdote became emblematic of how the film transcended criticism and entered lived experience. It wasn't just studied, it was felt. Religious scholars, surprisingly, joined the discussion too. Some saw echoes of redemption theology in Clarice's journey. Sin transmuted not through confession but through compassion. The mirror became a confessional, the needle a penance. Others read it as secular grace, a story about forgiveness without divine intercession. The godmother's ambiguous nature fueled debates about the film's spirituality. Was she an angel, a metaphor for memory, or simply a storyteller stepping between worlds? The ambiguity made it rich ground for theological exploration. Politically, the film sparked discourse about class and gender labor. Clarice's work at the Dye Factory and her later role as a dressmaker became touchpoints for conversations about women's invisible labor in both history and modernity. Sociologists used it in lectures about the emotional economies of care, how love and attention are distributed unevenly across social hierarchies. The movie's tagline, "Every fairy tale leaves someone behind," was quoted in essays about capitalism, race, and even post-colonial identity. That a film could stretch from the personal to the systemic, like this, shows how deftly it wove universality into specificity. Yet not all feedback was reverent. Some mainstream viewers found a movie's pacing punishing, its metaphors overwrought. A popular review on Letterboxd joked, "If mirrors could talk, they'd probably tell her to hurry up." Others called it pretentious, claiming that its symbolism drowned emotional spontaneity. And yet, even the critics who disliked it couldn't ignore its craftsmanship. The cinematography, costume design, and performances were universally acclaimed. It was one of those rare cases where a movie divided audiences not over quality but over comfort. It simply made some people feel too much. Interestingly, the film's online fan community developed a reputation for deep-dive analysis bordering on obsession. They cataloged every mirror, every reflection, every shift in Clarice's dress color. They even mapped the ratio of reflective surfaces per minute, discovering a consistent pattern that mirrored the Fibonacci sequence. Whether intentional or not, that pattern became another mythology, proof to fans that the film contained sacred geometry. The director denied this with a smirk, saying, "Maybe beauty just likes math." In the awards circuit, The Ugly Stepsister performed better than anyone expected for such an introspective film. It won Best Screenplay at Venice, the jury prize at Cannes, and later earned nominations for cinematography and original score at the Oscars. But more significant than trophies was the discourse it left behind. University courses began including it in syllabi on modern mythopoesis. Book clubs discussed it alongside novels like Wide Sargasso Sea and The Bloody Chamber. And social media transformed Clarice into an icon of imperfect authenticity. Screenshot of her unfinished gown circulated with captions like, "Healing is never symmetrical." The most moving event tied to the film wasn't cinematic, but human. A few months after its release, an art therapist from Italy reported that her patients, mostly adolescent girls, had begun referring to their inner critics as the stepsister. They used that phrase to externalize self-loathing during sessions, a therapeutic shorthand derived from a movie. Imagine that, a work of fiction giving language to pain. It's the highest compliment art can receive. So when we talk about critical perspectives and cultural events surrounding The Ugly Stepsister, 2025, we're really talking about how it reawakened cinema's oldest purpose, to question the stories that define us. It forced critics to ask why we need beauty to be redemptive, why kindness must always be rewarded, why ugliness still terrifies us. It reminded viewers that every judgment we make about others is also a reflection of what we fear in ourselves. And as the debates continue between scholars, fans, cynics, and believers, the film quietly endures as a mirror that never stops reflecting new faces. Because that's what great art does, my literature-loving friends. It keeps arguing with the future long after the applause fades. And The Ugly Stepsister has already begun its lifelong argument with us, with history, and with the very idea of what makes a story worth retelling. Behind every hauntingly beautiful film lies an equally fascinating constellation of chaos, accidents, improvisations, and miracles that somehow coalesce into art. The Ugly Stepsister, 2025, may appear deliberate, slow, and meticulously composed on screen, but its production was a whirlwind of creative tension, an alchemy of vision and vulnerability. The process itself mirrored Clarice's journey, imperfect, uncertain, and quietly triumphant. It's almost poetic that a film about imperfection was birthed through so many imperfect circumstances. The idea originated in 2018 when the director, Luca Marin, was still an emerging playwright in Florence. He had written a short stage monologue titled The Other Slipper, in which the stepsister addresses a mirror for 20 minutes, alternating between rage and heartbreak. It was staged in a 60-seat theater, with one spotlight and no props. That piece became a cult favorite in the underground European theater circuit. Producers began urging Marin to adapt into a film, but he resisted for years, claiming that cinema forgives beauty too easily. The turning point came during the pandemic lockdown, when he watched his own reflection on Zoom for hours during online rehearsals. "I realize a camera is the cruelest mirror," he said later. That's when the idea grew legs. Development started in early 2021 under a small European co-production between Italy, France, and the UK. The budget was modest, barely €6 million, which meant no lavish CGI or sprawling sets. Every creative decision had to serve double duty. Practical constraint turned into poetic device. The mirrors, for instance, were chosen from flea markets across Europe, each carrying its own cracks, fogs, and histories. Marin reportedly told his art director, "Find mirrors that have already seen sadness." They collected over 80 of them, labeled and tracked for continuity, like living characters. Casting Clarice was the production's most crucial challenge. Over 60 actresses auditioned across Europe, but none could fully embody what Marin called the dignity of jealousy. The role eventually went to Amandine Laurent, a French theater actress known for her unglamorous intensity. Marin discovered her from a viral clip of a stage rehearsal where she accidentally tripped mid-monologue and kept performing, integrating the fall into her lines. "That fall," he said, "was Clarice." Laurent initially declined the role, worried that audiences would despise her character. Marin convinced her by promising that the film would make ugliness a form of honesty. The first week of shooting began in January 2023 inside an abandoned monastery outside Bruges. The production team transformed the cold stone halls into Clarice's estate using minimal set dressing, candles, mirrors, worn fabric. The cinematographer, Sofia Korylenko, used only natural light and fire sources for interior scenes, forcing the actors to adjust emotionally to the flickering warmth. This created an uncanny realism. Emotion shifts subtly depending on the candle's burn intensity. It also led to one of the production's most unpredictable patterns. No two takes ever looked identical. Korylenko embraced the chaos, calling it light breathing through character. Sound design was another radical experiment. Because the film was shot entirely in mono, the boom operators had to choreograph their movements like dancers. Every whisper and rustle was captured in real time. There's an anecdote that during one pivotal scene, a mouse scurried across the floor, and instead of cutting, Marin whispered to let it continue. The mouse's faint pattering stayed in the final mix, symbolizing the world's indifference to human heartbreak. When critics later commented on the existential realism of the soundtrack, Marin simply smiled and said, "That was a mouse." One of the most debated production choices involved the fairy godmother's portrayal. Veteran actress Isabelle Fournier was initially offered the role, but declined, calling it too spectral. The part eventually went to Spanish actress Inés del Toro, whose background in flamenco brought unexpected movement to the role. She infused her gestures with rhythm, every turn of her wrist resembling a dance step. Her costume designer noticed this and began sewing subtle pleats into her sleeves to enhance motion blur. That decision led to one of the movie's most mesmerizing visual effects. Her shadow moving out of sync, achieved not digitally but through careful choreography and double exposure. The slipper, now legendary in film trivia circles, was engineered by an actual confectioner rather than a prop designer. Marin wanted something fragile but beautifully edible. The sugar crystals took months to perfect. They had to withstand limited handling, but still melt gradually under lighting heat. During one rehearsal, an assistant accidentally licked the slipper, assuming it was candy, and Marin loved the absurdity so much that he left faint fingerprints and tiny imperfections visible in the final prop. "Perfection dies under curiosity," he quipped. Amandine Laurent's preparation for Clarice bordered on method acting, but without the grandiosity. She reportedly kept a cracked handheld mirror on her bedside table for the entire 3-month shoot, refusing to replace it. Crew members said she would sometimes rehearse her lines by talking to her reflection rather than co-stars, muttering variations until her expression matched the emotional tone. She described the process as learning to speak without needing to be seen. Her performance earned her widespread acclaim and an avalanche of psychological speculation about her off-screen identity. When asked about it, she simply said, "Clarice made me quieter. I used to feel silence. Now I listen to it." Filming was not without tension. The mono recording meant dialogue had to be near perfect. Background noise could ruin takes. One evening, a rainstorm interrupted shooting for hours, but Marin refused to halt production. Instead, he rewrote the next scene overnight to include rain as an emotional motif. The next day, Clarice's pivotal line, "The sky is crying what I cannot," was born from that improvisation. Ironically, it became one of the film's most quoted lines. Another on-set legend involves the dye factory sequence. The river where it was filmed was freezing, but Laurent insisted on wading barefoot through it for authenticity. Her feet turned blue during filming, and the camera captured it unintentionally. That unfiltered blue became symbolic in post-production. Korylenko adjusted the entire color grade of that sequence to match her skin tone, creating the eerie, wintry aesthetic fans now recognize instantly. The marketplace scenes were filmed with real townspeople rather than extras. Marin wanted spontaneity, so he told the local residents to continue their daily routines while the crew filmed guerrilla style. Many of the unscripted smiles and glances came from people who didn't realize a movie was being shot. The authenticity of those interactions gave the market its pulsing realism, a living world around Clarice's isolation. Music was perhaps the most collaborative element of the production. Composer Inés worked on set during filming, often improvising themes live on a portable keyboard while watching scenes unfold. She composed a haunting ghost lullaby that plays throughout by recording her own breathing and rhythm with Amandine's movements. "I didn't score a performance," she said later. "I inhaled it." Her soundtrack became inseparable from the film's identity. Later performed in minimalist concert halls where she played alongside clips projected on stone walls. Fun facts abound. During editing, Marin reportedly cut 47 minutes of footage because, in his words, they explained too much. Among the deleted scenes was an extended dialogue between Clarice and the prince discussing moral exhaustion. He removed it because explanation ruins empathy. Another deleted scene involved the godmother singing softly to Clarice as a child, a flashback that would have broken the story's ambiguity. Marin said, "Mystery is mercy." The crew had a peculiar superstition involving mirrors. Before each day's shoot, they covered every reflective surface with linen until the camera rolled. "Mirrors absorb fatigue," said the set decorator, half jokingly. Whether out of ritual or belief, the practice created a meditative atmosphere on set. Crew members often spoke in whispers even between takes, giving production a monastic quality. One visitor described it as a film set turned into a confession booth. Even post-production carried quirks. The editing suite had a mirror placed behind the editor's chair, so that whoever watched dailies could also see their own reflection. Marin said he wanted editors to confront their emotions as they cut scenes. "You edit your face first, then the film," he told them. By the time filming wrapped, the crew had amassed hours of documentary footage capturing the process. Much of it will likely appear in the upcoming making of short Through the Glass Lightly, which promises to reveal unseen footage of the rainstorm improvisations, mirror rituals, and sugar slipper crafting. Financially, the production was almost a miracle. The film's financing teetered on collapse twice, once after a French co-producer withdrew funding over commercial viability concerns. A private donor, a retired art historian from Bruges who had attended the original play, saved the project with a personal investment of 1.2 million euros. When asked why, she said, "Because stories about being seen deserve to be seen." Marin later named one of the dye factory children after her. The movie wrapped under budget, astonishing given its aesthetic richness. Marin credited his team's resourcefulness. Recycled props, natural lighting, and borrowed costumes from defunct theater houses. Even the final credits were filmed rather than digitally inserted, projected onto a silk curtain and captured in one continuous take, allowing shadows of crew members to flicker behind the text. Watching that, you realize the credits themselves are part of the story, people literally standing behind their work. In hindsight, the production of The Ugly Stepsister feels like an act of communal therapy, as much as filmmaking. Everyone involved seems to have left changed. The assistant director later said, "We didn't make a movie about forgiveness. We practiced it." It's hard to imagine a more fitting environment for a film that so gently redefines beauty, failure, and grace. And perhaps that's the greatest production secret of all, that this haunting masterpiece wasn't born from perfection, but from shared imperfection. Every flicker, crack, and improvisation became proof that art, like people, can stumble its way into truth. And as Marin once said during a Q&A, "We didn't shoot scenes, we shot souls learning to breathe." The world of The Ugly Stepsister, 2025, feels less like a fairy tale kingdom and more like a half-remembered dream. The kind you wake from with a taste of dust and longing still on your tongue. Every stone corridor, every wisp of candle smoke, every echoing footstep seems to carry memory within it. The film setting is not mere backdrop. It's a living organism that breathes, decays, and resurrects alongside its characters. In many ways, it's the film's truest narrator, the silent witness to envy, grace, and redemption. To appreciate it fully, one must see how every architectural curve and flicker of light is a metaphor, not a decoration. The estate where Clarice lives dominates much of the first half. Filmed in an actual 14th century monastery outside Bruges, the location's age becomes part of the storytelling. Its cold stone walls reflect not grandeur but burden. There's no fairy tale warmth here, only drafts and echoes. The long hallways seem built for penitence rather than elegance. The camera glides slowly through these spaces, as though afraid to disturb their silence. You feel the centuries pressing down on everyone who inhabits them. The use of narrow doorways and low ceilings subtly compresses the actors within the frame, creating visual claustrophobia that mirrors the moral suffocation of the household. This isn't a castle of aspiration. It's a museum of expectation. Lighting plays the role of emotional cartographer. In early scenes, it's oppressive. Pale daylight leaking through stained windows, throwing uneven patches of brightness that seem to mock Clarice's attempt at order. The cinematographer, Sofia Korylenko, famously relied only on natural and firelight, and you can feel the tactile truth of that decision. Shadows stretch and quiver, never still, making even static shots feel alive with instability. It's as if light itself refuses to choose sides. In the later acts, that same light grows warmer, softer, less judgmental, not because the sun changes, but because Clarice does. The world's illumination becomes a reflection of her self-acceptance. When she stands in the marketplace near the end, sunlight falls on her evenly for the first time. It feels less like lighting design and more like emotional punctuation. The dye factory and marketplace scenes contrast this gloom with grounded realism. Mud, mist, and smoke replace marble and silk. The color palette here is dense with ochres, moss greens, rust reds, an earthy palette that pulls the narrative back from fable into life. Every brushstroke of dirt or soot feels deliberate. Clarice's bare feet in the river, the workers' stained hands, the coarse fabrics fluttering on drying lines. These images transform labor into poetry. What's remarkable is how Korylenko avoids romanticizing poverty. There's no sentimental glow, no artificial soft focus. The grit stays grit, yet the camera finds beauty in it, a beauty that feels earned, not inherited. Sound design, too, becomes an invisible landscape. The decision to mix in mono wasn't just aesthetic minimalism. It was world-building. In a typical stereo film, sound surrounds you, it expands. Here, it closes in. You hear candle wax dripping, fabric rustling, hearts beating through dialogue. The lack of spatial distance makes every sound intimate, as if the world is pressed up against your ear. The first time you notice this is during the mirror-shattering scene. The glass doesn't crash outward but inward, folding into silence. That sonic inversion tells you that destruction here isn't explosive. It's implosive, emotional. The environment doesn't amplify the story. It absorbs it. Color serves as emotional temperature. The movie begins in muted desaturation, steel grays, faded violets, the color of regret. As Clarice begins to evolve, color seeps back in like blood returning to a sleeping limb. Warm hues appear in objects rather than skies. The red thread she uses to sew gloves, the golden candlelight on a child's face, the pale yellow ribbon dropped by Cinderella. By the finale, those colors finally reach the environment itself. The marketplace floods with amber sunlight. It's not just beautiful. It's symbolic of internal repair. The world's vibrancy doesn't change until Clarice's perception does. Cinematically, Marin and Korylenko choreograph the camera as a participant rather than an observer. The camera never moves without purpose. Early scenes use static framing, as if the world is frozen by decorum. When Clarice begins to rebel emotionally, the camera loosens, handheld shots trembling slightly with her uncertainty. During her first moment of compassion, helping the factory children, the lens lingers with gentle instability, creating the feeling of empathy learned through imperfection. By the film's final third, the movement becomes almost balletic, graceful yet grounded. The technical evolution mirrors emotional evolution, chaos turning into rhythm. Depth of field also carries metaphorical weight. The background often swallows the characters. Rooms seem deeper than they should be. The cinematographer achieved this by lighting the farthest corners brighter than the foreground, tricking the eye into perceiving endless depth. It gives the sense that the past is always watching from behind. In contrast, outdoor scenes flatten perspective. Sunlight erases hierarchy. When Clarice finally steps outside, she becomes one layer among many, not the center but part of a whole. That visual democratization marks her liberation more clearly than any line of dialogue could. The mirror motif, discussed endlessly by critics, becomes spatial rather than symbolic here. Marin treats reflections as alternate rooms, dimensions that store emotional residue. In several key shots, the camera's point of view seems to exist inside the mirror, gazing outward. Those inverted perspectives disorient you. You stop knowing which side of the glass reality resides on. This technique peaks during the fireplace scene, where Clarice hides a shard in her pocket. When she later glances into a puddle, the reflected firelight flickers exactly in rhythm with her heartbeat, suggesting the world itself now shares her pulse. The palace sequence, traditionally the most glamorous part of the Cinderella myth, is filmed with near-documentary restraint. Instead of wide establishing shots, we see fragments, a shoe heel stepping on fabric, sweat under powdered makeup, a servant struggling to carry trays. The grandeur is hinted at, never flaunted. Marin said in an interview, "Luxury is only impressive to those outside it. That philosophy defines the sequence. Everything opulent feels fatigued. Chandeliers sway slightly from unseen drafts. Laughter sound hollow. The world of perfection is exposed as fragile theater. Even transitions between settings follow emotional logic rather than geography. Scene changes often occur via elemental continuity. Fire becomes sunlight. Tears become river water. Smoke becomes fog. The effect is dreamlike but also subconscious. It suggests that Clarice's journey is happening both in physical space and in psychological space. The environment morphs as emotion dictates. Symbolically, architecture itself mirrors class structures. The estate is vertical. Staircases dominate. The dye factory is horizontal. Lines of laborers in unison. The marketplace is circular. Everyone visible, equal. The film's progression from vertical to horizontal to circular echoes Clarice's emotional trajectory, from hierarchy to solidarity to wholeness. Its geometry as storytelling. Lighting again deserves praise for how it manipulates shadow. Shadows here are characters. In early scenes, Clarice's shadow often appears elongated, distorted across uneven walls. By the end, shadows fall naturally, proportionately, an unconscious marker that she has stopped hiding from light. During the riverside encounter with Cinderella, their shadows merge briefly on the water's surface before separating again. It's a fleeting image, easy to miss, but it encapsulates the movie's central idea: reconciliation through recognition. Every environmental element seems charged with intention. Even the weather evolves with the story's psychology. The film opens in perpetual overcast. Clouds hang like guilt. Midway, rain becomes catharsis. The final act arrives with wind, the motion of renewal. By the time sunlight pierces the frame, you've forgotten what pure brightness looks like. So its arrival feels earned, almost sacred. That gradual shift from confinement to air is so subtle, you don't notice it until the last frame, when Clarice's hair finally moves freely in the breeze. The editing contributes to this immersive geography. Cuts are slow, often dissolving rather than jumping. The rhythm feels like breathing. Inhale on static frames, exhale on motion. Time stretches and contracts fluidly. You might watch a candle burn for 30 seconds or blink and miss a week passing. This elasticity turns space into memory, elastic, uncertain, haunted. Marin once described his editing style as architecture dreaming of empathy. It's an apt description. Even the smallest props carry topographical meaning. The broken mirror shard functions as Clarice's compass. She checks her reflection not to admire but to locate herself. The red thread she carries ties scenes together literally. It appears coiled on a table, around her wrist, then embroidered into a sleeve. The thread becomes the film's visual through line, binding disparate spaces into a single continuum. By the film's conclusion, the physical and emotional environments merge seamlessly. The marketplace, open, sunlit, filled with human voices, is the anti-castle. There are no corners for shame to hide, no ceilings to stoop beneath. It's a world that breathes again. The final shot, Clarice walking among mirrors displayed for sale, completes the film's environmental circle. She moves through reflections without losing herself. The mirrors are no longer prisons but portals, open windows to ordinary life. If one were to summarize The Ugly Stepsister through its cinematic element alone, it might read like a poem of opposites: light and shadow, confinement and release, silence and sound, stillness and motion, all converging into equilibrium. Every frame whispers that beauty isn't symmetry, it's sincerity. The film settings and visuals achieve what words rarely can. They make emotional transformation visible. And that, literature-loving friends, is why the movie feels so haunting even when nothing happens. Because the world itself happens, and in doing so, it becomes a character that forgives. Behind-the-scenes stories from The Ugly Stepsister, 2025, feel like folklore in their own right, half-truths whispered by crew members, half-magic accidents that became masterpieces. You get the sense that the set was less a workplace and more a monastery of emotion, where everyone had to unlearn vanity to tell a story about it. What emerged was a creative environment that mirrored Clarice's inner world, raw, unpredictable, illuminated by accidents. Every anecdote seems to echo the film's thesis, that imperfection, when approached honestly, becomes transcendence. Production began in the coldest winter Bruges had seen in decades. The monastery chosen as Clarice's home had no central heating, and crew members reportedly wore gloves even while operating cameras. Breath fogged every frame. Instead of fighting the chill, the director, Luca Marin, embraced it. He told his team, "Let the cold film us." That decision changed the visual language entirely. You can see the actors' exhalations during indoor scenes, a subtle ghosting effect that makes every word look alive. It wasn't special effects. It was survival turned aesthetic. The cinematographer later said, "We didn't add atmosphere, we froze it." To maintain the film's emotional integrity, Marin implemented an unusual rule. No mirrors allowed offset. Cast and crew had to surrender any reflective items, compacts, phones, even polished metal accessories. If we're telling a story about reflection, he said, we should stop checking ours. Makeup was done using tiny handheld glass fragments provided by the art team, all imperfect. Actors joked about becoming mirror monks. The restriction changed their performances. Freed from constant self-surveillance, expressions grew rawer, more intuitive. Amandine Laurent, Clarice, later confessed that after shooting ended, looking at a normal mirror felt too loud. Lauren's immersion went beyond method acting. It bordered on ritual. She lived inside her character's bedroom set for 3 weeks before filming, sleeping on the same straw mattress, using only candlelight. Crew members recalled hearing her recite lines to the walls in the middle of the night, experimenting with tone and silence. When asked why, she said, "Clarice would rehearse kindness in daylight." Marin allowed the solitude but forbade visitors, turning that section of the monastery into what locals nicknamed the Quiet Wing. Ironically, scenes filmed there required the least direction. The emotional atmosphere had already steeped the space. Anecdotes about Marin's directing style verge on mythical. He's known for giving poetic, nonsensical instructions instead of technical cues. During one take, he reportedly told Laurent, "Breathe like the room forgives you." In another, he asked a lighting assistant to make the air sadder. Yet somehow, everyone understood. Actors describe his direction as emotional telepathy. He preferred first takes, believing repetition drained sincerity. "If you rehearse pain, you lie," he once said. The result was a collection of moments that feel lived rather than performed. Small stumbles, unscripted laughter, trembling hands. Marin called those gifts from the chaos. One of the most enchanting behind-the-scenes phenomena involved the sugar slipper. The prop's fragility was notorious. It melted slightly under hot lights. Crew members had to store it in a refrigerated cabinet between takes, guarded by the pastry chef who built it. During filming of the famous slipper scene, Condensation caused a thin fog inside the shoe. Instead of reshooting, Marin kept it, saying, "The slipper should breathe too." Later, critics wrote about the metaphysical mist within the shoe as a symbol of fleeting perfection, unaware it was just humidity. The godmother's shadow delay, the eerie half-second lag noticed by sharp-eyed viewers, came from an accidental camera malfunction. The dual-lens system used to film her scenes glitched due to humidity, desynchronizing exposure. When the playback revealed the uncanny lag, the editor assumed it was intentional and left it untouched. Marin, upon seeing it, declared it divine coincidence. "She exists one heartbeat behind reality," he mused. There's also the infamous candle incident. During a pivotal emotional scene between Clarice and her mother, a candle unexpectedly toppled, nearly igniting the hem of Laurent's gown. Instead of panicking, she stayed in character, using the flame as part of the moment. She whispered, "Even the light wants out," then calmly smothered it with her handkerchief. Marin kept the take. Later, when Laurent was asked whether she'd been afraid, she said, "Fear is what made the line true." That spontaneous line remains one of the film's most quoted, despite never existing in the script. The monastery itself seemed to conspire with the production. Crew members spoke of hearing bells, even when no nearby church rang them. The sound designer, initially annoyed, decided to record the mysterious tolls. They were later woven faintly into score, audible only during scenes of decision or forgiveness. Listeners described the faint bells as echoes of conscience. Marin shrugged when asked about them, saying, "Maybe the building remembered something." Filming days followed a strict ritual rhythm. Silence before dawn, breakfast shared communally without phones, one collective reading of a poem before call time. The poems changed daily. Rilke, Plath, Neruda, each chosen to mirror Clarice's emotional state in the day scenes. The assistant director called it therapy disguised as schedule. Actors often cried during these morning sessions. The poem on the final day of shooting was Mary Oliver's Wild Geese, which ended with the line, "You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves." Fittingly, the closing scene that day captured Clarice walking freely among mirrors. Perhaps the strangest behind-the-scenes story concerns the film's editing process. Marin insisted that the editing suite mirror the set's candlelit ambience. He worked only at night, using projection rather than monitors. His editor, Amar DeVos, described their sessions as monastic seances. They watched dailies in silence, editing with gestures instead of conversation. Marin would raise a hand to signal a cut, bow his head to approve a dissolve. The result was an editing rhythm that feels meditative, as if the film itself breathes between thoughts. Rue's score underwent its own peculiar journey. Because the entire film was shot without temp music, she composed themes afterward by syncing her heartbeat to Clarice's movements. She used a stethoscope and metronome to match tempo to Laurent's breathing in key scenes. The Ghost's Lullaby, famously derived from reverse vocal hums, was discovered by accident when Rue reversed a vocal take to check its pitch. The melody aligned perfectly with the film's emotional climax. "It's as if Clarice was already humming backward," she said. Crew members also developed strange attachments to props. The red thread used in multiple scenes was so treasured that they passed it between departments like a relic. By the final shoot, it had frayed almost to nothing. Marin wrapped around his wrist during the last take and never removed it. He was later seen wearing it at the Venice premiere. He called it the artery of the film. Not all moments were mystical. There were practical struggles. Freezing rain ruining outdoor sets, cameras fogging from breath, and local villagers complaining about late-night church bell recordings. One memorable night, the generator failed mid-scene. Rather than stop, the team lit hundreds of candles scavenged from nearby shops. The resulting shot, Clarice's face illuminated by trembling light, became one of the film's visual signatures. Marin later admitted that the entire sequence existed because of a power outage. Post-production secrecy bordered on obsession. Marin banned test screenings, fearing premature interpretations. Only 5 people saw the full cut before its premiere. Rumors spread that an alternate ending existed, one where Clarice vanishes entirely, leaving only her reflection in the final frame. Whether that version was real remains uncertain, Some crew claim to have seen it, others deny it. Marin's cryptic response at Q&A, sometimes endings see us before we see them, only deepen the myth. Even after release, the set continued to generate legends. Visitors who toured the monastery claimed that certain mirrors used in filming still fog up spontaneously, even in warm weather. Locals joke that Clarice still breathes there. One of the assistant camera operators swears that during pickup shots months later, his lens briefly reflected a figure in a red-threaded dress standing behind him, when no actor was present. Superstition aside, these stories became part of the film's ghostly aura. The bond between cast and crew endured long after filming. They meet annually on the movie's wrap date to light candles and read excerpts from audience letters. Many of those letters come from viewers who saw themselves in Clarice's imperfection. Laurent reads them aloud in her soft, accented English. "It's strange," she once said. "We made a movie about people who feel unseen, and now strangers write to tell us they see us." If there's one truth that all these behind-the-scenes tales share, it's that the ugly stepsister wasn't crafted. It was conjured. It was born from frost, silence, accidents, and devotion. The crew didn't just film reflections. They lived among them. And in doing so, they built a world where technical mishaps became metaphors, where a mouse's footsteps became philosophy, and where a melting slipper turned fragility into legend. When asked what he learned most from making the film, Marin paused for nearly half a minute before replying, "That perfection dies too young." And maybe that's the purest behind-the-scenes secret of all, that beauty, real beauty, only arrives when no one's tried to impress it. If there's a soul hidden inside The Ugly Stepsister, 2025, it breathes through its themes: envy, perception, forgiveness, identity, and quiet, redemptive power of imperfection. Every frame, every silence, every flicker of light feels like an allegory waiting to unfold. It's rare to find a movie so deliberate in its symbolism and yet so human in its emotional rhythm. Nothing in it is ornamental. Everything means something. It's as if Luca Marin built a cathedral of metaphor and then filled it with the small, trembling voices of people who finally learned to stop performing worthiness. At its heart, the film is an exploration of envy as both poison and mirror. Clarice's jealousy of Cinderella is not treated as a moral flaw, but as a natural, even necessary, reaction to invisibility. Envy becomes a story's pulse. Not a sin to be purged, but a symptom to be understood. Marin visualizes envy as distortion, reflections that warp, light that burns instead of illuminates, voices that echo out of sync. The film's treatment of envy reminds us that jealousy is never about the other person. It's about the self you fear you could have been. When Clarice whispers, she smiled like sunlight, and I flinched. It isn't hatred. It's pain recognizing grace. The symbolism here is almost biblical. Lucifer watching God's light and mistaking it for rejection. Yet the film's genius is in its tenderness. It forgives envy for existing. Mirrors, unsurprisingly, anchor the film's symbolic universe. But they aren't instruments of vanity. They're instruments of truth. Every time Clarice confronts her reflection, she isn't admiring or despising her appearance. She's negotiating with her own conscience. Early on, the mirrors are warped, clouded, cracked, representing self-perception fractured by comparison. The moment she finally smiles into a clean reflection at the film's end feels less like triumph and more like surrender. The mirror forgives her not because she becomes beautiful, but because she finally stops begging it to. The mirror, in this movie, is God stripped of judgment. The red thread she carries throughout serves as a delicate countersymbol: life, continuity, connection. It appears subtly at first, wrapped around her wrist, stitched into cloth, later embroidered into her final dress. Red, of course, traditionally connotes passion or sin, but here's the color of memory, of persistence in the face of shame. It's the line that refuses to break even when the story does. The film's closing scene, with the thread glimmering faintly against her cream-colored gown, suggests something profound, that our flaws, when acknowledged, become part of our fabric. The thread no longer binds her to resentment. It binds her to truth. The slipper, that quintessential symbol of fairy tale salvation, undergoes its own metamorphosis. Traditionally, it's the emblem of divine reward, a vessel through which destiny recognizes virtue. But in Marin's hands, it's reimagined as fragility incarnate. made of sugar crystal. It literally melts under warmth. Its ephemeral nature symbolizes the unsustainability of perfection, beauty that collapses under human touch. When Clarice refuses to force her foot into it, she's not rejecting love or fate. She's rejecting an idea of worth that depends on someone else's approval. The slipper becomes the film's ultimate anti-symbol. It dissolves to reveal that happiness cannot be worn. It must be lived. Then there's the godmother, or more accurately, the concept of intervention. Her half-second lagging shadow, her ambiguous reality, her tired voice, all symbolize delayed enlightenment. She's not a fairy at all, but the embodiment of perspective, arriving just one beat too late to prevent pain, but exactly in time to interpret it. Her repeated line, "Every gift has its shadow," acts as the film's thesis. Every virtue carries a vice. Every act of love carries a possibility of control, and every dream contains the seed of delusion. She exists as both blessing and warning. That wisdom rarely arrives before the wound, but always arrives. Time itself functions symbolically. The film refuses linearity. Its pacing mimics memory, cyclical, hesitant, recursive. The slow unfolding becomes a metaphor for healing, which never follows narrative structure. The repetition of daily rituals, sweeping, sewing, listening, forms a kind of secular prayer, emphasizing how transformation hides within monotony. The passage of time is marked not by events but by light. Morning becomes metaphor for acceptance, dusk for regret. Clarice's first dawn scene outdoors feels like time forgiving her. Another major theme, and perhaps the most quietly radical, is the film's meditation on visibility. Clarice's entire tragedy stems from being unseen, not unloved. Marin transforms visibility into a moral question. When does looking become objectifying, and when does it become understanding? The camera answers by refusing to glamorize. It watches her as an equal, not an exhibit. The repeated framing of Clarice through doorways and reflections visually reinforces her marginality, while also inviting us into her emotional interior. In essence, the movie dismantles a gaze, both cinematic and societal, that divides people into beautiful and not. The result is a rare, ethical form of visual empathy. The marketplace at the end becomes a symbolic Eden, not of purity regained, but of labor reclaimed. It's the space of the ordinary, the shared, the visible. Mirrors hang for sale like democratized reflections. Anyone can own one now. Clarice walking among them represents freedom from hierarchy. The world that once judged her now includes her. The symbolism is potent. The market, capitalism's arena of exchange, becomes transformed into a metaphor for communion. Clarice doesn't escape society. She reinvents her role within it. Her final smile, framed by sunlit mirrors, feels like a secular resurrection. Rain, wind, and light all operate as emotional grammar. Rain purges, wind liberates, light reconciles. Each element corresponds to psychological states: despair, release, and peace. The way the weather shifts without overt emphasis makes it feel organic, as if nature itself is responding to Clarice's growth. The cold hues of her early environment, muted blues, silvers, gradually warm into golds and creams. Color becomes language. The film's dialogue between shadow and illumination mirrors her inner reconciliation. Streaming platforms courted aggressively. Marin eventually sold rights to Mubi for a record art film acquisition. The film's streaming debut sparked renewed conversation. Online forums flooded with frame analyses, quotes, and homemade mirror challenge videos, where viewers filmed themselves reciting Clarice's lines into mirrors. Within 6 months, the movie had grossed over $60 million worldwide, far exceeding expectations. It won Best Cinematography at Cannes, Best Foreign Feature at the British Independent Film Awards, and was nominated for the Academy Award for Best International Film, losing narrowly to The Zone of Interest. Yet Marin famously avoided Hollywood's embrace. He turned down offers to direct a major studio adaptation of Beauty and the Beast, saying, "Why would I cage the beast again?" Instead, he retreated to Italy to teach a workshop called Imperfect Frames, Cinema Without Vanity. Enrollment sold out in hours. What fascinates me, though, isn't the revenue or accolades, but the cultural afterglow. The film changed how directors and critics talk about visual ethics. It revived conversation about analog realism, sparked new debates on mono-sound emotional power, and reintroduced slowness as virtue. Within a year, 3 independent films cited Marin as influence. Film students dissected its ratio, lighting, and minimal score. Scholars coined terms like empathetic austerity to describe its aesthetic. Financial analysts later noted an odd phenomenon. Cinema screening The Ugly Stepsister saw increased concession sales despite its somber tone. People lingered after credits, one theater manager said. They just sit there, eating quietly. That lingering encapsulates the film's hypnotic craftsmanship, a technical design so immersive that audiences forgot the real world for 2 hours, only to return gentler. In hindsight, The Ugly Stepsister, 2025, accomplished something rare. It redefined technical mastery not as excess but as restraint. Every lens choice, every breath of silence, every flicker of candlelight became proof that craftsmanship is not about control but surrender. The film's success, artistic and financial, showed that modern audiences still crave sincerity over spectacle, reflection over distraction. And perhaps that's Marin's final technical trick. He built a mirror that doesn't flatter, only reveals. Cinema, in his hands, stops pretending to entertain, and instead remembers how to witness. That's not just technique, it's resurrection. The cast of The Ugly Stepsister, 2025, became a phenomenon of its own, a collection of artists who treated acting not as performance but as confession. Their chemistry, restraint, and quiet honesty gave life to a film that could have easily drowned in abstraction. Watching them feels less like watching actors embody characters and more like watching souls remember something they once felt but forgot how to express. The entire ensemble, from the leads to the nameless workers in the dye factory, seemed united by a single guiding principle: vulnerability over vanity. Amandine Laurent's portrayal of Clarice is the film's gravitational center. Before this, she was known mostly to Parisian theater circles for playing sharp-tongued tragic heroines. Yet here she becomes something completely new, translucent, wounded, luminous through her restraint. What's remarkable isn't her dialogue delivery, but her silences. She performs emotion through posture, not pitch. Her stillness speaks louder than any scream could. In interviews, she said she built Clarice not through backstory but through breath. Each inhale was envy, she explained. Each exhale was forgiveness. You can see this method on screen. Her chest movements punctuate scenes like hidden monologues. During the slipper sequence, her face barely moves, yet an entire opera of emotion flickers through her eyes. Critics called her performance a masterclass in emotional economy. Her co-star, the ever-graceful Isabelle Fournier, reimagined Cinderella as something far more complex than the angelic stereotype. Fournier, previously famous for light comedies, surprised everyone with her minimalist approach. She stripped away sweetness, revealing fragility underneath. Her kindness often trembles. Her voice catches on syllables as if she's perpetually afraid of disappointing her own myth. When asked how she prepared, she smiled and said, "I try to be good for too long." The exhaustion came naturally. The dynamic between Laurent and Fournier became legendary because they never play antagonism directly. Their scenes radiate tension precisely because of politeness. One woman desperate to be seen, the other terrified of being envied. Jean-Pierre Duroc's performance as the prince adds an understated melancholy to the narrative. Duroc, best known for his work in The Square of Winter, brings quiet dignity to a role often reduced to ornament. His prince is self-aware but paralyzed by expectation. His gaze often feels detached, even sorrowful, as though he recognizes the superficiality of his own fairy tale. In one striking moment, when he watches Clarice quietly refuse the slipper, Duroc doesn't react outwardly, yet a faint shift in his jaw betrays respect. He's not the dream. Duroc said in an interview, he's the mirror of everyone's dream fatigue. Marin praised him for being a man who understood stillness. Veteran actress Brigitte Lemoine delivers a heartbreaking performance as Clarice's mother. In her hands, the archetypal wicked stepmother becomes an essay on societal decay. Lemoine captures exhaustion like no one else, the elegance fraying at its edges, the cruelty born of fear. She barely raises her voice, and that restraint makes her menace more real. During a press conference, she described her role as the ghost of every woman who believed she had to be ruthless to survive. Her final scenes, frail and defeated, transcend morality and slip into tragedy. Many critics argued she deserved the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress that year. Even Marin called her the moral shadow of the film. If you love this analysis, my literature-loving friends, please subscribe, and tap the bell, not for algorithms, but for the growing circle of hearts who see cinema the way we do, as a gentle act of remembering what it means to be human.